Alaska there.
Yep.
And unfortunately, I can't see the chat box at the same time, so I won't be able to chat interact with folks as we go. But so yeah, as Michelle mentioned, I've been up here a while, and for the past 17 years, I've been the education director at a science and learning center right at the entrance to Denali National Park. And I was part of a nonprofit organization working with the Park Service, and our mission was to promote and support science and research in the park and to share it with the public. So my role is really on the education end of how to disseminate park science, not let it be dusty binders on shelves. So it's working with scientists and working with all the travelers and visitors that come to Denali. So it's a lot with the tourism industry here. So here in Denali, as you can see on the map, it's just below the center of the state, but it's 5 hours away from Anchorage. So most people fly in Anchorage, or they'll take a cruise ship up to Anchorage or Seward and then do train or buses up to the park. So it's fairly remote, and then the park is 5 million acres. And it's a park that's been around for over 100 years, 103 years that it's been a park. And over that time, it's, initially it was Mount McKinley National Park, has the highest mountain in North America, but the reason it became a park was because of that sheep there in the photo, and the poster, the Dall sheep, one of the few places in North America where you can see white wild sheep like this. And that's the reason it became a national park. So for over 100 years, it's been this place that people have come to see wildlife out there in the park, on the park road. It's like a wildlife safari at times, just one road in, and people riding buses and looking for wildlife and seeing these amazing Alaska range mountain vistas. But it's also been a place where people have come here and studied this landscape and brought their curiosity with them. So this presentation, I'm going to kind of cruise through a little bit quicker than what I'll normally do with some of our visitors, because I want to try to cut down on time. So I won't go in as deep as we often do with a longer set of time. But what I'm going to do is share with you some science nuggets, just some unique science bits about the park that we often will share this with people right before they go out into the park. So this is kind of a primer for anyone that's sort of science curious, that when you come here to the park, this is some of the cool stuff that's in there and kind of behind the scenes of the park. So I have a bunch of these little science mysteries. So the first one is, here's a landslide that happens right along the park road, right across the middle of the photograph. That horizontal line, that's the park road, and about 38 miles out from the entrance, this landslide happened back in 2013. And it was just discovered by some staff that were out there checking the road. Now, up there in the top left in the circle, in the middle of that circle, for perspective, there's 2 geologists standing up there in that photograph. The slide came down across the road is about 30,000 cubic meters of material, or 3,000 dump truck loads of material that came down, and a lot of it in these frozen blocks of debris, very large. So the question for you all to think about is, what might have caused a landslide like this? And here we know on that particular October day that there's no earthquake action that was happening that day or previous days. Wasn't unusually rainy. The temperature was about normal for October, right around freezing. And so to really pinpoint it, the trigger of what caused it is somewhat unknown, yet we do know that permafrost, and we've been looking at permafrost all around the park, is pretty consistent, and there's consistency in some of the thawing that's happening of permafrost around the park. So this next image, okay, it'll take a second for it to start, but this is active detachment or mass wasting that's happening. This is some botany crew. They flew out to an area that has a regular study site. It was originally, this plot was originally looked at back in 2001. In 2013, there was a wildfire that happened in the area. And then just 2 years later, the botanists were out and to look at this site after it had been burned, and just walked upon this active detachment here, where chunks of the forest floors just flowing downhill. Pretty unique thing for them to discover. And what we do know is that going back to permafrost and what's going on here in the park, the permafrost throughout this area has always been somewhat discontinuous. So here in the top left, back in the 50s, the blue represents where we have known permafrost, and as you get up to warmer colors, a little bit less permafrost. So we do know that around here, people are building house, digging holes. It's kind of hit or miss where you might find permafrost. It's somewhat discontinuous, but the data from the studies and ground truthing that's happening in the park is, we know that in the last 50 years, we've seen a whole lot less permafrost, and we have a couple long-term study sites that are looking at permafrost and soil temperatures and seeing that this line that Denali sits upon, where virtually everything north of Denali in northern Alaska still is pretty continuous permafrost, and everything south of the Alaska range is almost no permafrost. So we do sit on this line, but this line is moving north and it's leaving the park. So that really within just not too many years here, a decade or so more, we won't have permafrost here in the park. And that does have a whole lot of implications for everything from our roads to off-gassing of carbon, sequestration in the soils. A big topic there to explore. So looking at permafrost and how it affects the park, we do know that climate change is quite a contributing factor to that. But why is it important to all of us? Why is climate change here in Denali, and us looking at it here, why is it important to us? And what can we learn from it? What we do have here in the park is this unique environment where we have this intact ecosystem. It's, as I mentioned earlier, it's 5 million acres, a big space. So we have a lot of parts of the ecosystem that are unencumbered, untouched by humans, other than climate change or atmospheric influences. So it's in general, most areas, it's a great place to come and study and have vast tracts of land that really just, you don't have the impacts of human interactions. So that gets into my next little mystery nugget here, and that's looking at some of the wildlife here in the park, because the caribou here in the park, we have a herd, roughly about 3,000 animals in the Denali caribou herd, and this is somewhat of an intact herd that is around the parks. Sometimes it's just going right outside the park and coming back in, but it's a great place for us to kind of look at population dynamics of a large ungulate like this, and looking in particular at their population and prey and predator dynamics. So one of the things that's been really interesting is to look at some of these population numbers and through our long-term studies of both caribou and wolves. So here's a chart showing population of caribou back from the mid-80s up until present time. And we can see the population has changed a little bit, and people will question, well, what causes their population to change? What are the factors? And certainly some of the most often things that come up early are predation by wolves, and wolves are well studied here in the park, just as long-term studied as the caribou. So that certainly is a factor, and we can put the wolf population numbers here in red underneath the caribou, and we can see some correlation there. We can see when the caribou population was high in the late 80s, wolf population was similar and following similar paths. And then in the early 2000s there, 2008, we suddenly saw them diverge and go in different directions. So that would have us, well, look at what other variables are there. And another obvious one is the weather and their accessibility to food. The caribou in the winter, they rely on reindeer moss as their primary food source that they're looking for in deep snow or snow that has been melted and refrozen. That all makes it hard for them to find winter food sources for them. So back to the chart here, in the bottom, there's little asterisks here with above average snowfall winters. And we can see that in the early 90s, we had several years of above average snowfall. Then that most likely was the strong factor that influenced that population drop in both the caribou and subsequently in the wolves. And then throughout the other years here, we can see some influence. But we can see that from this, what the caribou biologists believe is really that weather and that access to their winter feed is a much greater influence than the influence of predators like wolves. So looking at this predator-prey dynamics, it's one of the things that draws people to this area. People see photographs of caribou and moose and wolves and bear, and this little video here, I'll just play a little bit of it here to save on time, but this is a common scene that people might see here up in Denali. A moose and her calves and a grizzly bear coming in behind, and it's some pretty amazing things that people can see here in the park, and it's such a large park that has protected this intact ecosystem to allow for this, and to be able to see it from the window of your bus is just pretty amazing. So someone was very lucky in being able to capture this video footage here. And you can see that the moose is very intimidating to that bear. So it's in this particular scene, the cow and her calves, they got away from the bear. They were safe that day. So for visitors in the park, the things that they often hear about is, oh, I hope I get to see the Big Five. And the Big Five, as we call them, the charismatic megafauna of the park. Lot of interest in those, and yet here we know that there are smaller creatures that play a pretty significant role in the park's food web. So here's another small mammal in the park that has been studied a while, and it's pretty fascinating what we know and are learning from this creature. So here's a little guy that lives throughout the circumpolar region, burrows in the ground. And that's the Arctic ground squirrel. It's kind of it's the northernmost or largest ground squirrel of the family. And what's really amazing and fascinating to scientists, for all its implications, is its abilities to adapt to this harsh winter climate. And it hibernates for 7 to 8 months of the year. And what is just crazy still to me is that it can drop its body temperature down to 27 degrees Fahrenheit or -3 Celsius. And during that hibernation time, its heart rate will drop down to 3 beats per minute. It's usually 200 beats per minute. So also their breath or respiratory rate drops down to 1 to 2 breaths per minute. So that metabolism just goes way down. And then approximately every 3 weeks or so, it'll start to shiver and wake up and warm itself up slowly and be awake for about 15 hours and then go back down into its hibernation. So this whole warming mechanism and its implications on its body to survive and not be damaged by that cold is what scientists are really quite interested in. And so there's a couple labs that are studying Arctic ground squirrels and how they do this and how can they do this without harming their bodily functions. So there's a scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks that's been looking at this, and what she's really keying in on is that what is it that can keep their brain from being harmed when they get down to almost no oxygen to their brains for days or weeks at a time. And so she's looking at particular proteins that are within the bloodstream and studying how, when they wake up, how that works. What's that mechanism? Because the implications are that there's some tie-ins to neurodegenerative implications in the brain, just like with Alzheimer's. And we also have some other scientists are looking at is there possible ways to learn from this and find treatments for Alzheimer's. The idea that some of their core functions of their body can go down so low and metabolism drops so low that we even have some NASA scientists are looking at are there things we can learn here that would help us with long-term space travel? That how do we have people or creatures survive in a low metabolism environment? So here in the park, we know that the ground squirrel is this important food source within the food web. When you look at the entire web of the park and where energy is flowing, ground squirrel sits in the middle of so many food webs, both from the avian world to the mammalian world. Yet we do not know a whole lot about their population numbers. So this graduate student, Nigel Golden, he's from Harvard University, and he's been looking at the population dynamics here in the park. So not only do they feed so many of the other animals here in the park, but they also, in their burrowing of the ground, they're actually aerating the soil, they're transporting seeds, they're altering the environment in the way they colonize an area. So there's this fascinating implication there with their population, as well as looking at climate change and how that impacts the availability of land that they can habitat here in the park. So it's some really fascinating things that we've learned and continue to learn about Arctic ground squirrels. Now, another species that adapts to the winter here is they take a totally different track, and that is they migrate out of the park for the winter, and they'll travel to 6 different continents around the globe. So this is just a few of the bird migrators that head out of the park this time of year. Just yesterday, we had huge groups of sandhill cranes flying over us just outside. So we know that these birds are these ambassadors for they're here all summer long, then they're out all over the world, and then they come back again. And I've had the pleasure of working with some scientists on a study here of a couple different songbirds. This is the Blackpool Warbler. So on the map on the right here, you can see roughly the pink areas, its habitat in the summer, the kind of the breeding and summer feeding habitat, and yellows the migration routes. And we do know that they're down in South America, but it's kind of rough, a pretty rough map of where those birds are during their migration. And we wanted to know a little bit more about the Blackpool Warbler, because it is the songbird that has showing the fastest decline of any other songbird in North America. And it'd be really important to figure out what's going on with the Blackpool Warbler population. So a group of scientists here in Denali, as well as 5 other sites around North America, started looking at this collectively. And it's a very small bird. It's just about 12 grams, the bird. So putting a GPS collar on a bird like that just does not work for a bird that's traveling that far and flying across the Gulf of Alaska. So new technology has helped in this regard. And so the little photo here is of a geolocator. There's no battery in there, and yet it can store data. So as long as we can recapture the bird, we can get the data. And it captures location by a light indicator in there that is looking at the time of the duration of light per day and the solar angle. So from that, we're able to determine latitude, longitude. And to capture those birds here in the park, we use mist nets and decoys like this. This is a gray-cheeked thrush, another bird we're looking at. And the other study sites that are doing similar captures and placing of these geolocators are here in the top map. And then we do know that from those color-coded areas that there's a pretty good fidelity, as in the birds return to the same places. So we do know that birds that we captured in Denali went all the way down to the Amazon basin, and then all the way back to Denali, to the same bush in Denali, and were captured in the same area. Now, still looking deeper, what's causing their population to drop so much? And that's a big question, and it's really an unanswered question. But from our old map to our new map, using the geolocator data, we have finely tuned their routes. And what we do know is that over this 12,000 mile migration, they follow one path going down, where they go all the way over to the often over to the northern Atlantic coast. Up there is almost as high as New England there, and then do this long flight over water down to South Americans. Some of them, the birds are flying for 60 hours straight over water before they get down to the South America. And then coming back, they take a slightly more direct route, hopping over to Florida and up that way. But with this data, we can actually pinpoint some of the locations are more precise than others, is from that geolocator device. And we can pull it up right on Google Earth. And one of the bird scientists said, I found the bird landed in this guy's backyard in Kentucky and sat at his bird feeder. And they had a discussion about, should we contact this guy? And they decided not to. But from that, they're figuring out what's going on with its habitat in the north and the south. And really what they're leaning towards is that the birds are being lost in that migration. A lot of birds are being lost in the migration north and south. And so that's helped refine some of their questions in that area. So then my last little mystery here is the other migrator is people that come to the park, and us as visitors to the park, even myself being a visitor here only 20 years, we come to this park with our own values, and a lot of people come because it's this amazing wild place. It's the landscape unencumbered by humans, other than this small dirt road that goes out 90 miles into the park. And that idea of wilderness is really it's a human question, and yet it's something that park managers value and we want to look at. And so for the past 25 years, the park has been trying to figure out what are the qualities of wilderness that people want and that we're trying to preserve here. And how do we measure whether is it very wild or only partly wild? And one of the ways is through soundscape science. So scientists have been monitoring sound in the park because we all have some pretty strong ideas of what we should hear or shouldn't hear in wilderness. And so it's been a pretty fascinating program. It's helped guide the park management in their work with flight seeing, planes flying over the park. Even in vehicles here in the park, we have gone to a silent or a quieter reverse beeper when trucks back up and there's a beeping sound and heavy equipment. Things like that we can do to preserve some of the wildness of this park. So real quick, I'm just going to go through some fun stuff that the park scientists have gathered. So they have stations throughout the park and they're collecting sound data year-round, 24/7, and then they can run that through analyzers now and identify some sounds, and there's still some that they have to go back and listen to. So I'm going to share with you a couple samples from that are kind of fun, if this works. So in this first one here, let's see if you guys can hear this. And here's where I can't see my chat box to see. Michelle, can you hear anything in that one?
Yes, I could. Yep.
Okay. So, in wilderness, one of the great food sources here in the park for birds is mosquitoes, and it's also one of the rites of passages for people that travel in the wilderness area. So that's the sound stations picked up certainly lots of mosquitoes here in the parks. Other sound stations have found stuff like this. This one's kind of funny. And that is the doll sheep who have come around one of the sound stations up high and decided to belch for it. And then here's another one. This one is interesting. So when the sound scientists went to visit the station to gather the data, this is how he found his microphones, and that white line all around the outside, that's the electric fence that was meant to keep the bears out. And what you're hearing there in the sound is some bear cubs that discovered the sound station, tore down the electric fence and chewed up all the gear, and then sauntered off. And so this this soundscape has been really fascinating to see, and it was here in Denali that they first started, and then since have taken it to other parks around the country, because it's become such a useful tool in helping to show the public what our impacts are on our landscapes. And here in Denali, you could go out backpacking and you could be out there for a week and not hear a plane, but only if you were in the most remote areas of the park. You virtually couldn't go out and not see contrails in the sky. So we can't quite get away from all air traffic and impact there, but it comes pretty close to being this intact wilderness ecosystem. So for us and our personal values here for this wild space, it's a great place to come and learn. It's a great place to come and kind of absorb some of this great human spirit you can get from time in wilderness, and a place where you can come and challenge yourself in wilderness travel or come see wildlife. And then here in the park, and this part of my new role here is a place where we can be tied to and learn from some of the cultural heritage of Alaska. And so dog sledding is one of the few modes of travel that is recognized as a traditional mode of travel, and it's allowed in the wilderness area. So snow machines are not allowed. Can't land your ski plane in the park in the winter, but you can dog sled, because humans have been dog sledding in this area long before this was a park, before it was a state. We know that humans traveled across the Bering Land Bridge with dogs. So there's this cultural heritage that here in the park we recognize as something important to teach people about and teach visitors about. So the lower right corner, that's the Kennels building. It's almost 100 years old building. It's the longest continuously used building in the park, and that's my office now here. And we patrol the park in the winter. We're working with scientists at study sites. We're hauling debris out of the park and preserving that wilderness character of the park by using a traditional transportation mode here. And then in the summertime, we are educating visitors about this unique.
Rip my sheet off.
Yeah. So the most of the visitors are coming through here, traveling on buses, and if they're lucky, they get to see wildlife or see bears from the park road. Some people go backpacking, and you really get to experience the true wilderness character, and might see some of the some wildlife when they're out that way. The park has just amazing scenery. Even if you don't see wildlife, the landscape will not disappoint you. So like other parks, Denali is this national treasure, place for us to learn from and be inspired by, and Denali does this quite well. So I'll end it there, and I hope that at some point everyone can come visit this park. It's pretty amazing. It should be on everyone's bucket list. Yeah, hope to see you up here someday. When you make it, when COVID lifts and we can all travel again. So I'll stop it there so we get a little bit of time for some questions, and we'll hand it off. I think we're going to take some questions in the auditorium. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So Fred, do you have any questions there in the lecture hall?
Yeah. I was wondering if you guys have any like visuals that you've made of the sound levels throughout the park.
Yeah, if you go to the Denali National Park website and under science and science resources, there's some great information on the Soundscape project. And in fact, the lead scientist that runs that program now, he's one of the most inspiring science presenters I've heard. He's pretty amazing. He has done some great interviews and even some so I believe on his pages on the website, he's even got some YouTube videos and some audio radio recordings as well. So you'll find a lot of good stuff there. And I do know they're doing it in other parks, like Jackson Hole is a pretty strong soundscape program as well in Grand Tetons National Park.
She reports having found it. Yes, thanks.
Great.
I have a quick question for you. So with the dogs in the park, do you have to take special precautions in terms of risk of transmissions of diseases to native canine populations, like parvovirus or things like that?
Yeah, our dogs are vaccinated for the common viruses, so definitely parvo, and our dogs we have a pretty rigorous veterinary schedule with them. It's not without risk, certainly, that we're out there in the park, but they're typically only going out in the park in the kind of in the dead of winter too, where it's things are a little bit less common, but to catch it's the park's probably the greatest concern over the wolf population is actually pet dogs coming in, people going to campgrounds, and we certainly have some concern about viruses being spread between pet dogs and wolves through those areas of contact out in the park at campgrounds. And yeah, but I haven't heard about any cases where we've caught anything or had to deal with any issues yet.
Thanks. Well, Michelle, you can go ahead and broaden the field.
Who out there in Cyberland has a question for David?
And feel free to type questions in the chat box too, if that's easier for folks.
I have a quick question. What advice would you have for someone who's looking to, once they graduate from college, get into something with the national parks or the conservation or something, along these lines?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it's what worked for me, and I realized I was kind of lucky in this regard, is being able to do internships. And I say lucky because not everyone can afford to do that. And I think many folks realize that. And I think the Park Service realizes that too, that in order to be able to, I'm just going to take a summer off or make very little money doing an internship for the summer, is not something everyone can just afford to go and do. But it does, that's really how many folks have gotten their foot in the door, is being able to sacrifice and either do a summer internship or do an entry-level summer-only job. And that's how most folks get into, at least to the Park Service, is working several summers where you're scrounging for work in the winter, and keep putting your foot in the door in the summer season. But my internships, as Gordon remembers, I did 2 different summers with the Student Conservation Association, and those really kind of opened a couple doors for me, because I did one with the Park Service and I did one with the National Forest Service, and to get those on my resume, and that was really probably the key for me. And then other folks will go the science route. That oftentimes the Park Service does hire, a lot of their scientists are coming after maybe 8 years in academia of entering the Park Service with a master's degree or higher. So that's another route as well. But the Park Service is trying to address that. I think like a lot of agencies is how do we get a more diverse set of employees here? Because it's there is a lack of diversity in a lot of these agencies.
Gordon has a question for you, David.
Okay, I'm looking at this question. I'm not quite sure I got your acronyms there at this ArcGIS, GIS, Arctic.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yep.
I can hear you. Okay.
I was trying to be efficient. I've got so many questions, and this was an exciting seminar, David. I want to get on the plane and come up there, but I don't get on planes anymore. I'll limit 2 questions to Arctic ground squirrels,
Okay.
not ArcGIS.
Okay.
Are they having troubles adapting to longer, warmer summers? And given their importance, even in the middle of the food web, would you consider them keystone species?
Yes, and that's a good question. The National Park Service throughout the system has identified, put labels on species as what they call vital signs for the park, or similar to kind of pulse and respiratory, but that they've identified key aspects of the parks which are vital signs, and Arctic ground squirrels are one, Dall sheep are another, and both of those for similar reasons. And that is, as we have a warmer climate, we have the tree line moving up the mountainsides. So essentially the high alpine zones of the mountains here in the Alaska range is getting smaller. So pika fit in that category as well with Dall sheep, that this alpine zone, prime habitat for those species, and especially Arctic ground squirrel. If we start getting into the woody shrubs, the dwarf birch, it is moving up the mountain. We know that. We have documented historic photographs, repeat photography throughout the park of the tree lines moving up and the habitat area getting smaller and smaller. So we speak about these animals of being on islands, like islands in the Pacific, that are getting smaller and smaller. So it's definitely of concern, and it brings about those existential questions about, well, if this park was here to appreciate and protect Dall sheep, what happens if there's no Dall sheep habitat? Similar to glaciers in Glacier National Park, or Joshua Tree in Joshua National Park as well. So it's definitely huge concern.
Thank you.
And a big question, and a big hard question too.
Anybody else from cyberspace have a question? I have a question. Have you started to see increased tourism because of the warming? Or is there some kind of modeling or predicting of what increased tourism what kind of impacts it may have on the park?
Yeah, just before COVID, we did have tourism was going up and up, and it was at its highest just before COVID. And the numbers, we're lucky here in the park because it's most of it is kind of coming with what we call industrial tourism, where it's coming through cruise ships, and then they rather than having everyone rent cars, so they're putting them on trains or buses. So they have a good mass transit system that's being used here. So it's definitely some impact, but not as bad as what you see in like Yellowstone or Great Smokies, if that's what you're asking about as far as human impact. The visitors and the dollar impact on the state was a great boon to the state, and a huge impact now with COVID. That's a great loss to us right now. We're starting to sweat here if things don't improve. And then Genevieve asked about bird migration and whether the drop in populations is over migration is higher than normal. And I think what you're asking, it's yeah, the decline in the Blackpool Warbler has definitely been in the last 15 years or so. So there's something going on in the migration just in the last 15 years where we do know prior to that, they're a pretty stable population. Hopefully that answers your question. And did I answer all of your question, Michelle?
Yeah, oh yeah, yep. Anybody else have a question? All right, well then, let's thank our speaker. And I'm sure he'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody wants to talk to him personally. Thank you. Virtual
You're
clapping
welcome.
here.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you all. Next week, we have Laura Blake, class of '99. She's going to talk about the implementation of the Federal Clean Water Act in Massachusetts. So hope to see many of you next week as well. Bye.
All right. Well, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, David. That was great.
So good to see you. It's so good to see Gordon.
David, that was really tremendous. That was an excellent presentation, and clearly you are an educator.
Great, thanks. I feel a little bit rushed because I typically go like an hour and 15 on that one, and so I didn't get to go into as much detail as I would normally do. But yeah, hopefully it was good.